So welcome everyone. I'm Michael Cahill, a dean here at Brooklyn Law School. Thanks to everyone for coming, and of course thanks to our panelists for joining us. Looking forward to a useful and illuminating conversation about efforts to promote diversity and inclusion in the legal profession. I expect it to be useful and informative for myself, and hopefully we'll have some lessons for me, recognizing the opportunity and the obligation that we have as part of our own educational mission to promote diversity, and the manner in which our own efforts can facilitate or impede the efforts of the people who I'm about to speak to, because obviously legal education is a necessary precursor to the practice of law. And so the things that we do can make it easier or more difficult to diversify the profession as a whole. So I look forward to getting the insights and lessons of the hard-won lessons of the people I'm about to speak to, so that hopefully we can have some information about how to move forward. Let me introduce our panelists. We are joined by David Djaha, class of 1988, the managing partner of Ropes & Gray, LLP. Alphonzo Grant, class of 1998, managing director in the Legal and Compliance Division at Morgan Stanley. And his classmate, Gloria Greco, also class of 1998, wealth management compliance executive at Bank of America Corporation. Thanks to you all for joining us. I think we can just start with a brief introduction to each of you without recapitulating all of your lengthy and impressive CVs individually. Perhaps each of you can say a word about your experience as it bears on today's topic, and what stimulated your interest in promoting diversity and inclusion, or what experience have you had with such efforts. And we can just start alphabetically with you, David.
Well, thank you, Dean Cahill. So I've been involved with equality and inclusion issues since law school. When I first got to my first firm, which was Proskauer, I had, the conversations were beginning to be more vibrant there. I was part of one of the kickoffs of the initial committees on diversity and inclusion at Proskauer way back when. Saddens me, it's interesting, and it saddens me that so many of the conversations that we're having today were conversations we were having back in 1988, 89. But it is, my involvement, it's always been something that's very, very important to me.
Alphonzo?
Yes, and similar to David, my involvement goes back to my very first days at Brooklyn Law School. At that time, there were very few people that looked like me in law schools in general, believe it or not. And one of the things that I think allowed me to strive and be the best student that I could be was the feeling of inclusion. And that was in large part due to a program that Brooklyn Law School had that was run by Professor Feldman, which may be a name that might be familiar to all of you, that really allowed a lot of folks of color to feel comfortable and to do their best work. And post that, I went on to, I think one of the things that I'm most proud of is working at Sullivan and Cromwell and helping them to develop their diversity and inclusion initiative program. And it was one of the first large law firms to have their own diversity and inclusion department. And so we can probably talk about that a little bit more, but it's been an ongoing life choice and process for me since then.
So for me, it was starting out, I started my career, I won't tell you how long ago, because that'll tell you my age. But at a time, let's just say that when it wasn't common for women to be working in a finance department on Wall Street, and I started my career at Merrill Lynch, and Merrill Lynch had a pretty robust diversity and inclusion sort of council. Probably, I would say, starting in the late 90s, we really kind of ramped up the work around that. And so I was, very actively involved in that. And then for a number of years, and then I ultimately went to law school, and I was part of the legal department, and part of the diversity and inclusion efforts that we had in our legal department, and then moved ultimately into compliance, where I also participated because it's an important topic for me. And for the last, the Bank of America acquired Merrill Lynch in 2009, and ever since then, I've played various roles, both at the enterprise level, at the Bank of America level, but also in the divisional level. Right now, I sit on our Global Risk Management Diversity and Inclusion Council, and that's our risk organization is about 6,000 people globally, and so I sit on the council that looks after our efforts in our division, and then I'm also the sponsor for the diversity and inclusion efforts within the compliance and operational risk function, which is a part of that risk organization. So again, another 3,500 people, and really pleased to say that our efforts just are continuing to ramp up. And I'm really excited about being involved in this panel today, because I also want to get some ideas, hearing from my colleagues, and also, certainly the questions are always insightful. So I'm really happy to be here. So thank you for organizing it.
Well, it is a pleasure to have all of you here. And I should say, we can take additional questions from people in the Q&A. So please use the Q&A function, and I will review questions as they come in. We'll try to have some space for people to ask questions at the end that I can pass on to our panel. But let's start perhaps at the outset by recognizing that diversity itself is embraces a lot of diverse categories. It's a big umbrella term, and efforts to promote diversity and inclusion can involve numerous different categories, from race to religion to gender to sexual orientation, and any number of other things, socioeconomic background, et cetera. And efforts to promote a more diverse environment with regard to any one of those categories may be different from efforts in another category. The needs and the proper responses and the efforts that are appropriate or optimal across different categories may vary. Primarily, I think our conversation today will relate to the very important efforts in our profession to promote racial diversity. But I do want to provide an opportunity to talk about other categories, or to talk about how approaches and efforts may vary depending on the target group or population. Maybe Gloria, we can start with you.
Sure.
If there are any experiences in other categories, or different ways in which you can describe how maybe efforts toward inclusion are tailored to the particular group for whom the outreach is involved.
Sure, and I think rightly we're going to focus on racial equity and equality and the drive toward that, because I think we could all acknowledge that that is probably one of the biggest things impacting our country right now, and as a whole in our profession. I think historically there was a severe, as Alphonzo said, real underrepresentation, even starting with law school, as an education, all the way through to professions. So I think our efforts, we really do have to double down on that. But in particular, for example, one of the things that we're focused on too is even within, let's say, the Black community and the Brown community, even then you layer on women in those communities have yet another level of, potential discrimination that they need to, even if it's soft discrimination, that they need to kind of navigate. So I think we're very focused on both of those topics. I mean, women generally, but also, obviously racial diversity, but then recognizing that in some cases, people are dealing with both those challenges. So, and I think the important thing is it has to start with empathy and understanding and communication, because I think until you really take on board some practical realities of what people are dealing with and listen and understand, the lens that people see things through because of their experiences, you really don't, that's the place you have to start. And then, go from there, because you really have to understand what they're facing.
Alphonzo, any thoughts? You're
Oops,
muted.
we're on mute.
Let me.
All right.
There you
I
go.
was nominating Gloria from the word in particular, empathy, because I think it's so key for us to have any sort of productive discussion about this, right? Because the trajectory of success will require of us, right? And this, when we look at panel, the diversity of this panel, we're missing some folks, but it's going to require a diverse group of individuals, and we all have different perspectives. And unless we have empathy, like Gloria said, we can't have the discussions. And I think that, you know, one of the things that I've learned is that whenever we talk about racial diversity, racial injustice, the history shows us that it always leads to opening up opportunities for other groups. One of the great examples for me was when I was at Sullivan and Cromwell, and we started talking about diversity and inclusion and how to develop that, and we came up with affinity groups that would help that along those lines. The white women partners at first were so reluctant to even be classified as a diverse group, let alone be part of a women's group, because they had come up in an environment where you did not, you know, flag yourself in that way. You didn't bring attention to yourself that way. You couldn't be your authentic self. You had to learn how to meld into a white male-dominated way of doing things, a culture. And it was so freeing for them over the next couple of years to see how those women became a part of a group and had such a great impact on the overall diversity and inclusion initiatives by just being able to let that guard down. And so it just resonates with the word that you said, Gloria, of empathy, because it really, all of this has an impact on all of us in the way that we live our lives and pursue our career in the field that we love.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because when everything was going on this spring and summer during George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all those terrible murders, the empathy and listening were a big key to how we were addressing our community. And Alphonzo, it was so interesting to me that we were asking people to please speak. We want to learn from your experience. I want to learn from your perspective. And I heard from so many people, including our partners, that they had never felt the license to speak about it in the workplace, that they had been brought up. And it was not just racially diverse partners, it was sexually diverse partners as well. That it was so freeing to them. It actually was some of the most emotional conversations I've ever had during my time involved in DE&I efforts, as well as a partner and manager at a law firm. And through those conversations, I feel like we made so much progress in what we're trying to do at the firm and as a legal community.
That's very useful to think about, and you know, recognizing that there are distinct groups that one might recognize as in need of increased presence in the legal profession, and there might be different approaches for each of them, but at the same time, overlapping efforts, and there might be ways in which trying to attract or appeal to one group can reinforce the ability to promote diversity for other groups, or have a more inclusive workplace in a sort of broader, more generalized way. Thinking about efforts to promote racial equity and inclusion in the legal profession, taking that as a sort of broad goal, one initial question arises with regard to how we can sort of make that goal concrete in terms of articulating exactly what we're trying to move toward, and importantly, how we can recognize whether we are making progress toward the goal that we have in mind. You know, what benchmarks can we devise? What sort of means do we have to measure whether we're moving toward the goal that we have? Some of those might be concrete, some of them might be a little bit more sort of soft and intangible. But I wonder, maybe starting with Alphonzo, how you think about the task of defining the goal in this context, and how you recognize whether we're moving toward the goal.
I think for me, I think there's a couple of ways. I think you want to measure it in pure numbers, but you also want to measure it in the quantitative aspect, the qualitative aspect of your programming, right? Of your work environment on the inclusive level. But if I could just touch on the quantitative piece of it, the numbers, and I'll leave the rest for my colleagues. But I think that's important because what I see is folks are afraid to say, hey, 5 years from now, we would like to have X number of Black partners or X number of women partners. And I think it's a stigma that has been attached to us from our generation in particular, related to quotas and affirmative action and things along those lines. It's given any sort of qualification number-wise like a taboo to it. But fundamentally, and this is the thing that you got to appreciate working on Wall Street, right, is that the numbers are the essence of how you track success, right? And so we can't be afraid to say, hey, right now we have 0 women partners. Right now we have 0 Asian American partners. We have 1 Black American partner. And 5 years from now, we would like to have X number, X number, X number. And we're going to do X to work towards that. The heck with what everybody else thinks in quotas. That's not what this is about. It's about setting a target and then putting all your resources together to achieve that goal. And so for me, I think that's the one thing we've got to get over, that taboo, to really move forward. That's where we're stuck right now.
David, how do you think about how to measure success over time?
So, Alphonzo, I definitely agree with you in setting numbers, but I think, well, actually for an organization like ours, we have to make sure we have the structures in place so that people can come to us and succeed. And someone recently said to me something that I thought was really interesting, and it stuck with me. Whereas diversity is a statistic, it's a fact, but inclusion is a state of mind and a conscious choice. And I think that when we're setting goals, I would love to set a goal that I'd like to have X number of partners that are diverse, whether it's gender, racial, sexual. But to me, I'd much rather create a community where people could succeed. And then I think it's going to happen naturally. So that while we will set targets, because lawyers are just type A, goal-oriented people. So working towards some sort of goal is important. I think more on the community level, I want to make sure that our firm is set up that people who come can stay and feel like they could have a career at the firm. And I think that's attacking it in both ways.
That's a very helpful set of thoughts and distinctions between how to approach the notion of diversity and inclusion. Gloria, any further ideas about how to think about either numbers, tangible or intangible ways of benchmarking success? Oh.
Sorry, I didn't know if you were going to unmute me or not. Sorry about that. So, I agree with both premises. I mean, in my work, it basically, we recognize that you have to measure it, right? You have to have some programmatic, and I think this is the point David was making, you have to have a mechanism, right, to establish those goals, articulate the goals so that everybody's on the same page and it's very transparent. And then you're measuring yourself against that. But equally as important is having sort of the things that enable the organic, right? Because we talk about the fact that if you leave it up to the organic, people tend to drift toward people who look and feel like them, right? And think the way they do. And so sometimes you do have to force it a little bit, so through the numbers and through the mechanisms, so that you're creating the opportunity for the organic to be successful. So, you have to be very deliberate about setting it up. So you do really have to kind of marry some rigor and discipline from a process perspective, but then, support it with the more qualitative aspects of it.
We've been talking a lot at the firm, and Gloria, on your point, this does not just happen. You have to be intentional to make it happen. If you want to see a change in your organization, you need to be intentional. You need to take steps that are intended to cause the effect or result in the effect you're looking for. So Gloria, I couldn't agree more with you.
So it sounds like what's needed is both an effort to build a community, which is really who the people are who are in the firm or in the room. But even with a certain community, one also needs to build a culture, which is a matter of how those people interact once you've managed to put them in this organization.
It's really interesting, Michael, on that point. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but the fact, and back to the point that was made earlier about, what's gone on in the past 12 months, right? Clearly, we all know that that's not new. The things that we've all come to sort of now have right in front of us is not a new story. But what was interesting to me going through, the second quarter of last year, was that if people weren't sort of living with a pandemic, kind of working from home, dealing with all that anxiety, and then that happened, it's almost like everyone was primed to have their eyes open. Like, I wonder sometimes if the George Floyd situation had occurred and everything else was normal, whether it would have grabbed hold the way it did, because I think people were open to the concept. Like, everybody was feeling vulnerable, I guess was my point, at the time that this occurred. And so it really, in my mind, kind of ramped up people's desire to want to feel a part of a community, to your point. And it having all of the dialogue that we had, because I think as Alphonzo said, historically, people didn't want to talk about, in fact, you spend all your time not to pretend that you're not female or that you're not Black or whatever, that you wanted to be colorblind, and the whole concept of, what does colorblind really mean? Nobody's colorblind, It just, I think people were just primed for the conversation. And so in some ways, timing is everything. And I think it created this sense of community that kind of oddly, because everyone is working from home and having to kind of connect on a different level and in a different way, I think has actually focused attention more effectively than it might have if everything else was normal. And I don't know if others agree, but that's how I think about it.
Without a doubt, that is so true. I mean, and for the simple fact that George Floyd was not the first, right? I mean, the African American community has been ringing the bell on this for years, for decades, and it's only now where it's really begun to take hold, because everybody actually had to sit and watch and listen, and so I think the answer is absolutely. Out of bad sometimes comes good, right? And I think the scary part now is, I use this analogy of the window closing, right? And you got to try to get in whatever you can before the window closes. And I think we're experiencing that again, right? The rah-rah is dying off. And again, people are starting to retreat back. Everything is okay. But, we have to really keep the foot on the pedal here to really, move through some change that will be systemic and long lasting.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps, people recognizing the issue is the first necessary step toward making any kind of progress. If we think about either numerical or non-numerical targets, sort of, redefining the population of people within an organization, or changing the way that they interact with each other. I was struck in an earlier conversation that I had with a couple of you about distinguishing between efforts that we might call sort of broad pipeline efforts. Sort of what kind of broad things are you doing to try to appeal to entire groups so that you can attract more people, as opposed to more individualized efforts with regard to a single person saying, how are we going to provide an opportunity for this person, what we might call the mentorship issue as opposed to the pipeline issue, right? One, trying to provide opportunities for vast numbers of people, one really identifying a person and saying, how are we going to be able to promote your ability to flourish and thrive in your career or in this workplace. I wonder if you could speak perhaps a little bit to either of those kinds of efforts as you've experienced them or as you've tried to promote them, how you've seen success, either in very broad-based outreach or in very narrow mentoring approach. David, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, so I think it's a two-pronged approach. So how do we get people interested in being lawyers? How do we get them interested in coming to your organization? And then how do you get them staying at your organization and being successful, however they may define personal success? And I think the first is really we do, and I think the industry does a lot of outreach to people who might have an interest in the law. We start in college. So we start mentoring, we take interns in college. We have had some very successful programs where we bring in rising first-year law students to spend the summer with us. They act more like a paralegal than a pure summer associate, but it's introducing them to really see what the law firm's like and whether this is the life they want. I think during the summer, we have pods. So we have affinity group pods. We have mentoring programs during the summer. In the recruiting to the summer program, we've taken steps to level the playing field, which I think is a big change. So we have been trying to, and I think it's been successful. One of the things I insisted upon was once a student is called back to our office for a second round, transcripts are not sent around. I don't want transcripts making a decision on whether this is the right person for the firm. We've set up a paradigm where we're asking our interviewers to ask the same question to everyone. So there's a level playing field in the interview process. And then just quickly, I'll say, because I don't want to take up too much time, but once you get to the firm, we have a pretty well-oiled machine of mentors, both associate and partner mentors that would start from day one. But then we have something more important, which are sponsors. And I think the distinction between the mentor and the sponsor is an important one because a sponsor takes more control of your career and a mentor is more sounding board and advice. So those are sort of the ways we're trying to handle it. And, as our lawyers get more senior, we have open conversations with them about what's working and what's not working. So those are sort of the way we're trying to deal with, making sure people feel like they could have a career at Ropes and Gray.
Terrific. Gloria, any thoughts?
Yeah, so, one of the things that we were actually in an earlier panel today, we're in a sidebar, we were talking about that I think is important. I was having this conversation with a group of my own employees recently about, advancement and development, and all of that is connected to retention, right? Because people will stay in an organization if they feel like there's an opportunity and there's a path for somebody who looks like them, to progress in their career. And so we were talking about sponsorship and mentoring and what role that plays and how do we even get a sponsor, right? Because a sponsor, as David said, is really somebody who's really going to be more active in advocating on your behalf and helping you be identified as a candidate, for an opportunity and other things. And so we were having this conversation. And I think one of the most critical things I would say to the students who may be listening, it's about the ask. Okay, so you have to start with, you have to have the credentials, right? You got to work hard, you got to get good grades, you got to do all those things so that somebody on its face on the paper would want to hire you. But just don't be afraid to make the ask. You have to make the ask. In other words, don't wait for somebody to just wake up and decide I'm going to sponsor this person. You have to kind of put yourself out there a little bit, because I think by doing so, you demonstrate some confidence that is going to shine through in your conversation with that person. It's going to make them want to have an investment in you, right? And there's the flattery, it's human nature, right? People are flattered, but I think there's just, trying to make that connection with someone and be clear about what you're trying to accomplish. Sometimes, I've had experiences in my own career where if I wanted to achieve something, a very vivid one that I can think of, where I actually took a risk and went and said, asked for 15 minutes on the time of somebody who was very senior to say, okay, here's my goal. This is what I'd like to do. What 2 or 3 things do you think I need to do more of or less of in order to be able to do that? And just by having the courage to ask that, ask for time and ask the question and ask their input, I automatically had a sponsor because that person then became very invested in helping me figure out how to get from here to there. So I just say you can't go in without the credential. You've got to do the work. You've got to make them want to take a risk on you, right? But then once you're there, some of it's on you to be able to sort of say, you know, this is what I need. I need help, or this is, you know, I'd like your help. So.
Alphonzo?
Yeah. And just to make it clear that the areas that we're each touching upon it isn't you know, a this or that sort of choice, right? It's really doing all of these efforts at once, and I think that in essence is what makes it such a difficult task, right? But the one thing that I'll focus on, because we haven't really touched on it yet, is the pipeline piece. And what does that mean, right? Because as David pointed out, you know, his firm has taken it a step beyond law school, focusing on college folks. But there's also the need to take the pipeline back even a little bit further, especially when we're talking about enhancing racial diversity in the legal field. Because at the end of the day, a quality education is extremely important to get into that pipeline, to getting into a top law school, to a good law school, and then ultimately onto a good job in the legal field. And if you don't have that educational exposure, you're less likely to get on that path. And so one of the things that was done a number of years ago, and I don't mean to talk all about Sullivan and Cromwell, but it just so happens they started a pipeline initiative where it was really bringing in a bunch of experts to really talk about how important it was to look beyond college and high school and see what are we doing to ensure that a racial diversity of qualified folks are getting into the pipeline, into the legal field. And I think there's a lot of things that we can do in the profession. I think one is to really mirror the blueprint that you see the engineering professionals or our colleagues there on that side have done. When it became clear about a decade ago that there was going to be a dearth of engineers in the U.S., both in terms of women and racial, the engineering community got together and began to support those initiatives to build their pipeline. As a result, you have these programs that we all refer to now, STEM and things along those lines, that have become second nature, but have been so critical in getting women and minorities into that field. And so as lawyers, we need to think about following that model. You know, I remember being a very young kid in junior high school, being first exposed to the law through a mock trial program that a teacher decided to put on. That teacher went to law school and decided not to practice, came back to teach, and did that. And that always resonated with me because I found something that I was pretty good at. You know, I got up and I was able to argue stuff and I did it well. And I remember that as a young child, and that really focusing me on a career that I didn't think about before. And so when we think about it from a legal profession, wow, wouldn't it be great if Brooklyn Law School got some of its supporting partners from law firms like Ropes and Gray and say, hey, let's go into these communities, underserved communities, and begin these programs in there. And let's start the fire going, get these people interested in law, get them on the right track, and then let's track this and let's see what happens 10, 15 years from now where these kids end up. You know, I think there's stuff that we can legitimately do that's already been crafted for us.
I think it's a great point. You know, we have at Bank of America a program that we participate in called Girls Who Code. And it's a similar thing, right? It's about trying to attract, especially in financial services where everything is so technology based, to try to attract more women in the profession of, you know, computer science. And so it involves like a competition. So there's some training, there's competition. It kind of, you know, so you're targeting high school kids who are, again, probably don't even, you know, maybe coding is even more something likely that they're going to get exposed to versus, you know, what we're talking about. But I think that those kinds of programs where you're really sort of opening up the mindset and just exposing, you know, what's possible. And the beauty of the legal profession is that it's a credential that enables you to do, like in my case, I'm not practicing law right now, but, you know, is a distinguishing factor or feature that enables you to do a whole host of things. And the skills that you learn as a lawyer are applicable to any, to be successful in almost any career. So to be, just, I'm always a little bit of an evangelical about law school, because I think it's such a great, way for people to educate themselves. But I think, giving people more exposure to it, particularly in underserved communities, would be, is a great way to build that pipeline.
And Malcolm Gladwell did his podcast this year. I actually lose track of what year it is because of the pandemic. It probably was in early 2020, about the legal profession and how we all march to the same drum for the past 40 years, yet we think we're going to change something. And he spoke about how we reward people who can think really quick. They do well on the LSATs, so he uses this term jackrabbit thinkers. They can answer those questions, so they're deemed the smartest people, and therefore they go to whatever law school they think is the law school they should go to, and then they go to the firms. And actually, when you get to the firm, we don't reward jackrabbit thinking. It's actually a very slow, quiet process. And he basically said to us, and he spoke at our firm, this is just a broken system, and you need to rethink it. And Gloria, I go back to what you guys are saying. If you're not intentional about looking at where the flaws are, we're not going to change it.
Right.
That's so true. If I could pick up on that point, I remember there was a woman that came out of CUNY. She got a law degree at CUNY, and she's done very well. She had a C on her transcript, 1 C in one class. I don't know, property or something, a class that most people don't do well. And because of that, a lot of the big law firms passed her over because there was the rule then you couldn't have a C on your transcript. This woman was one of the most brilliant people I've ever met. But more importantly, when you looked at her resume and you spoke to her, you saw qualities in her that would make her a fantastic partner. She had the ability to get stuff done. She was involved in several organizations. She was the leader. She was the head of her journal. She had written journal notes. The things that she had done are the qualities that we look for in effective lawyers that get stuff done. And think about how many people passed over that talented individual. I always wondered what had happened to her, because there's no doubt in my mind that she's successful in what she's doing because of those other skill sets. But it just resonates what you said, David. We've got a broken system here, and somehow we've got to say, dudes, let's fix this. Come on, we can do better.
And can I just say one more thing? Alphonzo, to that point, to that person, she's most likely a first-generation lawyer. So when she gets to the organization, whether it's my law firm or your bank or to Bank of America, she needs a different set of mentorship, right? My son goes to a law firm. He has a father who's a lawyer and a grandfather who's a lawyer. He knows what a law firm is. He knows the law firm politics. He's heard it around the dinner table all night long. That's another challenge we have to overcome, right? First-generation lawyers need different types of success routes. And it's part of the conversation we're having, but it's not, I don't think it's having, people aren't getting it as broadly in the industry as they should.
That's certainly true. It's interesting to hear the three of you describing, what I might call a mix of supply side interventions and demand side orientations, right? I mean, on the supply side, we as educators and employers need to think differently about how we recognize talent and what kind of people that we're trying to attract, and how we even define talent, such that we're not just limiting ourselves to the people who think fast, which is not necessarily even a lawyering skill, right? It's, can you think deeply? And are we recognizing that and rewarding it and reaching out more broadly to a group that is different perhaps from the group that we've attracted in the past, as a way of changing who has an opportunity to be in our profession? But Alphonzo, your story of the mock trial competition is really a good example of what we can do on the demand side to make people interested in law who wouldn't otherwise be interested in law, because it's a real challenge for us that a lot of people who end up being lawyers have had that idea put in their head somehow by the time they finish high school. And that means that effectively a bunch of people are deciding not to be lawyers by the time they finish high school, because that opportunity hasn't presented itself to them. And it really falls on us to make sure that we are making more people aware of the opportunity that they might have and stimulating their potential interest in law as a profession so that they can be, kids who lawyer and as well as girls who code, and they recognize that as an opportunity for themselves and can decide whether it is something of interest to them.
And Michael, if you'll indulge me one Joe Crea story while we're talking. So my father-in-law is Joe Crea, who the dean's chair is named after. And his story was infamous because he was delivering bread, okay? And as a child, he was a 12-year-old, was delivering bread to make some money for his family. And he came across a pile of books that a lawyer was discarding that were at the curb that in the rain, and it was books around bankruptcy law. And he picked them up and he's looking at them, and he came from a family of 10 kids. So he's first generation. All of his siblings were, in sanitation workers, police officers, sort of following that path. He was the only one. And it was all because he found these books and he started reading them, and he started realizing it picked his whole interest in business and finance and other things that he never had exposure to. And so, he reading these books he's probably 14, maybe he wasn't 12, but in other words, but the point is that he otherwise never would have encountered somebody who was a lawyer, never would have even, so it was sort of a happenstance thing, but then he went on to teach for, 60 plus years as a lawyer. So,
So true. And just to pick up on that point too, and what David was saying about the understanding the audience, if you will, the folks that you're bringing into your organization and their needs. Now you see the importance of affinity groups, right? When you think of the BALSAs in schools, the LALSAs and all those different organizations, the role that they play from a cultural perspective is so important because coming into an environment where you know nothing about it and being an African American, and you already have this stigma that society's put on you that someone like you is not smart, you're not intelligent, you're not supposed to be there in the first place. You are reluctant to go to anyone that doesn't look like you to even begin a conversation like, what should I be doing? And if I don't have a dad like Dave that I can go to, or uncle or aunt, or some other person that looks like me that I can engage with, it's hard to do. And so having a BALSA where you can go to students that have gone down that path, maybe a year or two ahead of you, and say, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do, and feel comfortable in having that discussion, goes a long way in allowing that person to develop the confidence they need to be a successful lawyer. So all of these things are interwoven. And Dave, I got to say, I'm so glad that you're talking about the things that Ropes is doing, because these are the sort of things that we were hoping we would get to, right? When we started putting the D&I processes in place, and now they're starting to resonate. And I think part of what we have to do is to continue to talk about these things, about the things that we're doing and the things that can be done, because it's the only way we're going to start moving these things along. But, I just had to hit on that point so people can understand that, because throughout my career, I've noticed there's always been pushback to having these affinity groups and what they mean. What do they say? Does it mean that we have to have all white affinity group? No, that's not what it's about. It's just describing what David said. It is saying, look, this is our place. We want to create an inclusive environment, and here's what these individuals need in order to do their best work. That's where we want to be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, those groups are where community and culture kind of meet, right? I mean, it's good to go to a place that has an inclusive culture, but if you're going to feel isolated when you get there because there is no one else like you, that really makes it difficult for that culture to succeed. At the same time, if you have your own subgroup, but that subgroup feels isolated from the larger community because there isn't a healthy culture of inclusion, that also can be a problem. So it's having substantial groups that also are in a position to contribute to the larger community and have a two-way dialogue.
It goes back to what I think it goes back to what Gloria was saying at the outset, which is it's about communication, right? If you have these smaller groups, you could communicate and understand the challenges you're having are not unique to you, so you don't feel as isolated, and you could communicate and help fashion a solution or steps to a better experience in the organization. So I'm just a big believer in communication, and I think that starts in the affinity groups.
You know, I think we talk a lot about allyship and, you know, having allies, and I think that's that's all about. And what was really kind of interesting for me is, you know, we started these courageous conversations, which I'm sure is not a term that only we use, but basically the gist of it is that you have this open communication where it's kind of a safe zone, and you know, with a small group of people, and you pick a topic that's, you know, sort of on, you know, on people's minds, but maybe they're not always comfortable talking about. And so, you know, over the course of the last year, obviously a lot of our discussion has been about, you know, particularly in inequality and inequity. And it was, what was really fascinating was I had some leaders on my team who are white men say to me, you know, I don't feel comfortable doing that because I don't feel like I'm credible. Like in other words, I don't feel like I have a right, if you will, to engage in this dialogue because it's not going to be, you know, people may perceive it as not being sincere or whatever. And I said, actually, it's the opposite, because without your voice at the table and without you hearing from other people, we're never going to bridge this. And in fact, it's actually the white community has more work to do here, you know, to make change. And the way to make change is if you actually engage, right? And you actually have a dialogue. So I think, you know, so what we've been doing with our affinity groups is also, you know, you don't have to be Hispanic in order to join the Hispanic group. You could be, you know, non-Hispanic joining that group, but so that you can be part of the broader community and have it be, you know, more integrated and make it become more business as usual over time as an aspiration. But, you know, just to broaden that network, and, you know, so you still have the benefit of having people who look like you and think the way you do and help with that, but also, you know, presents an opportunity for other people to learn and about that community and also, you know, be a part of the fabric. So it's kind of an interesting evolution how that's happening.
I love that you said that, Gloria, because what I learned over the past couple of years is those affinity groups, if they are not integrated, all we're doing is creating a similar isolated community, just with more people in it.
Right.
So that I'm just glad you pointed that out. But people who do not sort of identify with the affinity group actually need to be given the license to join and be part of it.
Right.
You know, I take a slightly different view, because I think it really depends on the environment that the group is in, because there are some affinity groups that need to be exclusive for a period of time until that group gets to a point where their confidence and their feeling that they can do it is of such that they can welcome in other allies. And if you push it too quickly on that group and says, no, your mandate has to be that everyone is allowed to join it without really assessing the environment, it can backfire as well. I've seen it work well both ways, but you got to be very careful about how you do it.
It's a really great point. Yeah. We have this thing called the Power of 10, which is really geared toward women, and it has spurned others that are now geared toward people of different racial groups. And so but the concept is that you have 10 women in a group that are kind of put together. It's sort of like a group mentoring type of arrangement, right? And so we've been doing that for a couple of years. And so I lead one of these groups, and we talk about what's going on in your life and work and navigating careers and so forth. And we decided a couple of years ago, we were asked, you know, that men wanted to have also the ability to participate in the Power of 10. So we did some sort of pilots, if you will, by having some men participate in those. And it was very interesting. To your point, Alphonzo, I don't think the groups were mature enough as a group to feel comfortable. We lost a little bit of feel, you know, that safe zone kind of feel. So so we decided to pull back on that a little bit and maybe, you know, let things kind of move along a little bit more before we reintroduce that. So I think you're absolutely, it's a great point that you're making. I mean, you know, these things have, they have to evolve, but you know, it has to be the right time. Agreed.
You're right, and I agree too. And my point more was in the planning, the discussion, the open conversations. They need to be targeted and really be for the people that are affected. I was saying more in our law firm community, we have a really vibrant women's forum, and for years, no men would go to their events.
Right.
And they're like, well, we're doing this presentation. How can a man not want to show up? And that was more of the license I was speaking about.
Yeah.
In terms of the experience, I think it actually has to be really focused with the people who are affected.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I mean, there certainly needs to be a safe space for communities to have internal conversations, while at the same time recognizing that men do not have the privilege of ignoring issues of sexual equality. White people do not have the right. It is only replicating your privilege to remove yourself from the challenge of dealing with racial equality. As a white person, it is a problem that we need to confront and address. It is a problem, for that matter, that we as white people created. So the idea that we should not take responsibility for helping bring about a solution, and to think that it is a problem for some other category of people is really irresponsible at best.
Agreed.
I wonder, just to sort of, it's been a long year. In a lot of ways, including ways that touch on this conversation directly. I wonder, as we near the end of this conversation, how hopeful you're feeling, or if the answer to that question might be overly negative, what is it that's giving you hope at this moment? I mean, what things do you find encouraging about the landscape, either broadly or in the legal profession, in terms of our opportunities to have a more diverse and inclusive environment? Are there things that you see that you take as signs of progress or bright spots on the horizon?
You mind if I go first, guys?
Yes,
because
please do.
To me, I think this is fundamental to what you were saying, Michael. The thing that gives me the most hope is the fact that I can be the only Black person on this panel and have my colleagues hit upon the key aspects of how we can be successful in this, because they're implementing it, they're living it, they're holding folks accountable. We weren't here 10, 15, 20 years ago. And to me, this is the absolute sign of progress, because this used to be a discussion that was just among Black lawyers. It used to be a discussion that was just among women lawyers. And now to have you guys taking the lead and having these discussions and helping to implement it is so important, because it is not just a racial issue or one group issue or a gender issue. It is something that we can fix collectively, because if we don't, we run the risk of missing out on those talented individuals, like I described, that woman from CUNY, right? And as lawyers, that is what we get a premium on, solving problems. And the one thing that I've learned over my last 25 years of practicing is that when you have a diverse group of people that are focused on solving a problem, man, you are going to solve that problem in ways you never thought of, because we all bring a different perspective to it. So, I'm very thankful, and it makes you emotional in some ways to see how we're progressing. So, I just want to say thank you, guys. And, I don't think you hear that enough, but thank you for doing what you're doing and continue to do what you're doing, because it's so important to this process.
Yeah, I think the fact that we're even having this conversation is telling, right? And I think, Dean, you should be congratulated for naming somebody, an executive on your staff that's, responsible, for driving the efforts for the school, because I think it's how the school becomes sustainable, right, for generations to come. And it's really the key. So I agree, though, with Alphonzo. I think that there's so much more. It's not. Even I observed that in the discussion, it's so much more substantive now. I mean, I think there's a real level of commitment and innovation that I haven't really seen in the past. I mean, there was always progress, but it was really inching along. I feel like the last year has really opened up to a lot of people how far behind we really are, and the need to really hold ourselves accountable and make more progress, and it's to the benefit of everyone. So
yeah, and I echo all of this. I actually feel very hopeful about it. I have to keep sort of my community in check, because people are so thoughtful right now about it that they want to see change immediately, and change isn't going to happen immediately, and we're not going to meet our goals immediately, whatever those goals are. But the fact that people are talking, the fact that I can have a conversation about racial inequity with a first-year associate at my firm is such a huge step. And it's not that I couldn't have that before, it's because they didn't feel empowered to have that conversation with us. So the fact that we're talking, we're solving together, makes me very, very hopeful.
Great.
Thank you all so much. And since Gloria just mentioned it, as we approach the end of the hour, I do want to take the opportunity to point out our Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Karen Porter. I'm not going to put her on the spot because I know that she is here, but I certainly do want to say her name, and I am so proud that she has been serving in that position for just over a year now. She started last January 1st. What a year it has been. And I am really delighted to have her in that role. And just as I occupy the Joseph Crea chair with pleasure and pride, as Gloria mentioned, Karen, in her capacity as Associate Dean, occupies a chair named after our former colleague, Arthur Pinto, and Stephen Boland, because Arthur, who is now retired, has made a 7-figure gift to the law school to support our diversity initiatives. And I am absolutely thrilled at his support and at all of the things that we are beginning to accomplish, and that I look forward to us continuing to accomplish as we move forward. And I'm very hopeful and thankful that we have the partnership and collaboration of alumni like the ones that I've been speaking with. So many, many thanks to you, Alphonzo, Gloria, and David. Thanks to everyone for attending. I'm particularly pleased that we were able to record this session so that it will live on, and perhaps we can use parts of it on our website. It's been a real pleasure and joy to have this conversation, and I thank you all for it.